And I just like to introduce our speakers. We are very fortunate to have some great speakers with us today. Jeremy Lundholm will be our first speaker. Jeremy is a plant ecologist whose research focuses on tidal land restoration, biodiversity on barrens, and vegetation classification. He works for transcoastal adaptations at St. Mary's University and CB Wetlands and Environmental Specialist. He's also an adjunct professor of biology at St. Mary's University. Welcome, Jeremy. Lena Malfquist is a registered professional biologist and a principal of Swell Environmental Consulting based in Victoria, BC. Lena provides vegetation and aquatic ecological expertise within multidisciplinary teams for private development projects and watershed scale land use planning for municipalities. Lena has a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science in Integrated Biology, Geography, and Environmental Sciences from the University of Victoria. And as a consulting ecologist, Lena ensures that an innovative whole system approach is integrated into all projects. Nick Page, our third speaker, is a registered professional biologist with Current Environmental Consulting. He has a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture and a Master of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of British Columbia. His professional work focuses on urban biodiversity, biological monitoring, watershed planning, and urban environmental design, including shorelines and wetlands. For over 25 years, he has worked for local governments in both Metro Vancouver and on Vancouver Island on biodiversity and sustainability topics, and has led biodiversity and urban forest planning for the city of Vancouver. And our fourth speaker, Rebecca Nielsen, is an environmental contractor at World Fisheries Trust. She has an associate degree in chemistry and biotechnology and a Bachelor of Science in environmental management. Rebecca works with stewardship groups such as the Stewardship Center, Gorge Waterway Action Society, the Bilston Watershed Habitat Protection Association, and all levels of government on environmental restoration, education, and research throughout Greater Victoria. Welcome to all four of you. And I'm still seeing the poll, so I think everybody else as well.
People can just close it off on their own screen if it didn't disappear naturally.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so I'll mute myself.
Okay, I'm assuming everyone can see that. Someone will tell me if they can't.
Looks good, Jeremy.
Okay, awesome, thanks. My name's Jeremy. Today I'm talking to you from Jibuktuk Mi'kmaq, aka Halifax, Nova Scotia. And today I'm representing Transcoastal Adaptations. We work on tidal wetland restoration as well as living shorelines and other nature-based adaptations. And I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on here, Kelly Umla, and a few of the other members of our team who helped me put this together. So I'm a plant ecologist, and just as a general introduction, from my perspective, what people do in nature-based solutions when they work with plants is they're taking advantage of what plants are already doing in ecosystems. So they're taking up space, their physical bodies are thriving, we hope, and their physiological functions are also really important. But what it boils down to for me as an ecologist is that plants intercept and transform energy and material. One of the oldest nature-based solutions is probably green roofing, and I worked on this for 20 years. So I'm gonna start with this before we actually move into coastal stuff. And in green roofs, what we are expecting from plants is that they use up water, and through those processes they transpire, and that cools the canopy. So that's one of the functions we want from a green roof is summer cooling. Just the fact that plants are green, they are more reflective of solar radiation than your typical sort of dark gray or black roof. That also enhances that function of cooling. In addition, the fact that plants are taking up water from the soil or the substrate helps with runoff, so it actually reduces the amount of water that runs off the roof into the municipal infrastructure. That's another benefit. Even in winter when the living biomass is has gone to sleep, so you've got a dead mat of plants on top of the roof and it'll come back in the spring, that's great. They still provide a function so that thatch increases insulation. It often, in our climate anyway, it traps snow and that reduces energy loss as well. So we're gonna come back to some of these themes, but let's move to the coast. one of the main reasons we use plants in living shorelines and green shores applications is their ability to reduce wave energy. This involves reducing the actual height of the waves, but also the velocity of the water coming in and overall the energy in the system. This has a knock-on effect of allowing more sediment to fall out of the water column and deposit on the surface, which is really important in tidal wetland situations where we want that marsh platform, that surface, to build up over time instead of sink over time and erode, that kind of thing. Some of the parameters that are most important in providing these functions and that differ between different types of vegetation are the height of the plants relative to the water depth and the density of plants. So those are some parameters that are important, and that comes back to plant selection in some cases. And this happens in winter as well. We'll talk about that. Of course, this works inland as well. In a living shorelines application, you've also got to contend with what's happening behind the coastline, so upland or inland of that. And plants, of course, with their bodies can intercept that overland flow in much the same way, reducing the energy and the velocity of the flows, that decreasing erosion and all that kind of stuff. And so, as we know, having a naturalized unmown edge can really help with what we're trying to do with living shorelines. Overall, the above ground effects of plants in these systems are coming from their organs, their shoots, their leaves, and their stolons. Stolons are simply above ground stems that allow certain plant species to spread horizontally. And again, the more coverage you have, the more of these benefits you're going to get. So we already mentioned the sediment issue. Plants can also accumulate sediment especially in like the Bay of Fundy, where there's a lot of mud, on their tissues themselves, and that can later deposit out on the surface. As we know, they reduce wave energy, but also just by virtue of covering a bare surface, they can reduce the amount of erosion that arises from raindrops hitting the surface as well. So that's very useful, and those are some of the main reasons from the above ground perspective of why plants are important for living shorelines. In winter, same deal. We mostly work with herbaceous species, at least below the high water line. And that dead thatch, when the perennials have gone to sleep for the winter, can still protect the surface. So that's very useful too. Below ground, of course, we've got roots and rhizomes. Roots are the energy and material that the foraging organs, and rhizomes are basically underground stems that allow plants to explore their space and spread vegetatively. Of course, this conglomeration of below ground organs helps the substrate stay together. It actually physically binds it, reducing erosion, of course. One of the things that's interesting in coastal ecosystems is when you see, analogs of engineering structures like cable. So these long rhizomes, this is a coastal barren that's obviously eroding, and these long rhizomes have become exposed, and they do provide that physical, actually holding different parts of that shoreline together. Of course, this site is probably lost already, but nevertheless, it's slowed because of the underground parts. Of course, roots and rhizomes create habitat for benthic organisms. This is really important. I won't focus on this. And they also, through physiological mechanisms, and also just litter dying and accumulating, add organic matter to the substrate, which is important for the overall health of the ecosystem. So a specific example on our coast, so this is the Mahone Bay Living Shoreline. This was set up in 2022. It is a Green Shores project. The certification is ongoing. And here we've used plants to stabilize the surface and reduce erosion. 3 components. First of all, the upland on the right of this picture here, the upland edge was planted with shrubs to reduce any effects of overland flow or any erosion issues happening at the top of the site. Then we've got a tidal wetland, which reduces wave energy, and finally a rock sill at the outermost edge of this. So this is a hybrid living shoreline system, and again, the rock sill helps reduce wave energy hitting the site as well. Okay. One of the things we're interested in, so some of the research that we're doing now is looking at different kinds of plants, in addition to sort of our salt marsh herbaceous perennials, which are grasses. We've got a shrub species that is salt tolerant that does live in the upper edges of salt marshes called marsh elder. And we are now looking at using this for protection. If you look at these images, the bottom image here shows what typically happens with the salt marsh grasses in between the marsh elder here. In the winter, they flatten out. They still provide some protection, but they're not very tall. And height is really important for wave attenuation. So we want to see if we can use this marsh elder, which as a shrub keeps that biomass. It's alive, the leaves fall off, but the biomass is still there, providing that physical structure in the winter. And so we think this could be an advantage in living shoreline systems. So we're actually planting it. This is Alison McNeil's master's project, or part of it, in the Mahone Bay Living Shoreline. She has planted it in just right above the salt marsh vegetation, and that's typically where it lives. It's sort of at the upper edge of salt marshes, right above the grasses, but before you get into terrestrial or upland vegetation, and it's done quite well. So we've transplanted these. She's testing different mechanisms of doing the planting, and this is at the end of the growing season, looking really good. We're heading into its first winter, so we're going to see how it works, and it has been planted at other sites as well. So we're working on this. The other thing I want to mention is annual plants. So in a tidal wetland situation, we're mainly working with herbaceous perennials. Those are the dominants. But there are also native annuals that can be a significant component of the systems. So we're now thinking, because the perennials tend to grow slower, they take longer to establish. And out here on the East Coast, we have issues sourcing plants. So we don't necessarily have 1 million plants to plant the whole thing to have 100% cover. So anything we can do to increase that cover early on is worth trying. And we're going to try seeding in the annuals. This is another student project. This is going to start next year, and we're going to see if they can kind of provide some of those functions of protecting the substrate before the perennials really get established. The final thing I'll mention before I stop is just aesthetics. In everywhere you live, there are options for plant selection that maximize the visual appeal of these sites. And as you know, or as you may know, salt marsh plants, some of them are less interesting than others. And so this is sort of a call to everyone to think about plant selection from that perspective as well, because people are looking at these things, and the more visually appealing they are, the better we can sell these to new potential clients and things like that. And I'm going to finish there. Thank you for listening, and I will pass this on to Lena. Let me just...
Thank you.
It's going to take a sec for me to get off the share. Black screen, sorry, it's happening, but it's just slow. Here we go.
There we go. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see the slides. My name's Lena Malmquist. I'm a RP Bio. I'm located at Chickawitch, which is colonially known as McNeil Bay in Oak Bay, near Victoria, BC, on the unceded and stolen territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, who are now known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And the project that I am going to talk about today is on Prospect Lake, which is in Saanich. It's a riparian restoration project, Green Shores project, on a private property at 5009 Prospect Lake Road. The owners are Fred and Kathy Haynes, and this is a project that has been certified gold in Green Shores. And I wanted to take you through the biological components and then also some of the other elements of the project. So this is what the property looked like prior to their purchasing it in 2002. It had a foundation from a house from about the 1920s to 1960s that had been removed, which was on the far right-hand side. And then you can see it's primarily lawn with some shrubs on the side right down to the shoreline. And this is a photograph of the shoreline at that time, which had been maintained as a bit of a beach access to the water, with lawn sort of right up to that high water mark edge. And the project we broke down into some zones to identify restoration treatments using reference sites from adjacent areas on Prospect Lake to determine sort of what would be the appropriate vegetation types for there. And it really was about balancing the ecology and the use of the property. It's quite a small lot, 0.11 hectares with 32 meters of shoreline, and primarily lawn, as I mentioned before. So we looked at sort of phase one on the right-hand side towards the water as being very ecology-based, and then up from the water heading towards the road as a balance of native species use and gardens, as well as the house location, which is in the bottom left, was where that's going to be built. So the the restoration plan was to remove part of the lawn, remove invasive species, primarily English ivy, reed canary grass, Himalayan blackberry, creeping buttercup, and using that reference sites to determine what was suitable, looking at planting shrubs, shoreline species, perennials, and ground covers, and also incorporating other habitat elements such as bird nest boxes, bat boxes, and nests for mason bees. So the zones that we broke out were looking at areas that already had dense vegetation. So those were the ones that we highlighted as green. Here we focus really on just removing the invasive non-native species. Then yellow had been a bit more invaded and used previously. So there, remove the invasive species and then start to plant native shrubs that could help to fill in that riparian area. The owners still wanted to maintain some ability to get access to the water. So there is a dock that they had put in, and we wanted to maintain a narrow pathway. And then blue was putting in some aquatic edge species. There was a little bit of wave erosion at the edge of the shoreline because there is some boat traffic on the lake. And then in the pink area, stop mowing and allow that to regenerate. There were quite a few native species present, various shrubs, various sedges in there. So allowing that to regenerate on its own, and then after a year, add native plants if necessary. And then finally, the red zone, which was to remove the lawn and plant a mix of meadow plants in the center to allow still some view through to the water. And then on the north side, filling out the shrubs to connect in with that north edge of the shoreline. So those were the different treatment types that we looked at from the ecological perspective. And just an overview, again, the whole property. And then this is what it looks like now after the work has all been done. You can see the house has been built on the bottom left. It's hard to see because there's a living roof on it. And then you've got some sheds and gardens that provide pollinator plants as well as food plants, a narrow stepping stone pathway down to the water, and then a more robust shoreline vegetation. And I thought I would just show you some comparison photos. So from 2016, before we started doing the work, 2022, you can see some of the planting starting to come in and vegetation where we've stopped mowing starting to come in. It is a mix of invasive and native plantings. So there is some management that's ongoing, particularly with reed canary grass. Again, looking from the dock back at the shoreline, the mowing has stopped. You can see a little bit of plants starting to come up, and then it's really gotten a lot thicker. Again, 2016 is looking a little bit over to the south side, allowing that vegetation to thicken up, and then over to the north side, 2016, and then a much more robust native riparian plants being established, and also the addition of some nest boxes. One of the other things that was key for this project was maintaining some of the other riparian habitat features. One of the trees fell down, so the portion of the stem that was still standing was left for wildlife habitat, but also the part that fell on the ground was also left in place to provide large woody debris in the riparian area. And then some of the other features that I wanted to talk about was it is a private property. It is the location of the house. So it was a small house that was built, 930 square feet for the house footprint. It does have a small upper level as well, which was 8.4% of the lot coverage. The rest of it remaining permeable and primarily vegetated. One of the interesting things about this project is that because Prospect Lake floods so much and the property is quite low, there was the risk of flooding if the house was located too low. So what they did was created a foundation in the house that allows if the water comes up high enough to flood underneath the house and back out. So all of the habitable portions of the house are quite high. There's also a living green roof by EcoSense, which is Gordon and Baird, They did a Gary Oak Meadow on the roof. The house itself was built green gold, so high energy efficiency and sustainable materials. A food and pollinator garden, nest boxes for mason bees, bats, and birds, and permeable surfaces for the parking area, and tertiary sewage treatment on site. So very high level of treatment. So here is one of the garden areas with some pollinators and food plants. The shed behind you has the mason bees, and you can't see the bat boxes, they're up higher, but they're over on that side as well. This is the foundation of the house, which is open and allows flooding to occur underneath. And then it can flood back out, so keeping the rest of the house safe. There is a photograph of the Gary Oak Meadow on the roof. The upper large portion of the roof is also a living roof. And this is the sewage treatment plant, which has been entirely vegetated with a native plant vegetation on the top of it. So it's actually very difficult to see, other than you can see one of the green lids there in the foreground. Here's the permeable parking area. And that is kind of the overview of the project. So primarily we looked at removing invasive species and allowing native revegetation where we could, and then extensively replanting areas that couldn't regenerate on their own, converting the lawn to native meadow, and then also adding in other elements that were usable for the owners, such as a food garden and pollinator garden. So thank you. I'm going to pass this on to Nick next.
Hello. Just going to grab my screen here. Can everyone see that?
There you go. Yeah, looks good. Perfect, Nick.
Perfect, thanks. I will start with the introduction. I will start that I respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Comox First Nations. They're traditional keepers of this land. And you'll see the project that I'm highlighting on the Dyke Road is particularly relevant for Comox. It's really in the heart of their community. And it was also nice to see that I'm the third plant ecologist to speak today. This is obviously something that plant ecology and shorelines go hand in hand. This is a picture actually from near the site, and it's a species now called Primula, used to be called Dodecathlon shooting stars. So a nice component of some of these estuarine marsh communities on southeastern Vancouver Island. And I'm going to talk about two things today. One is I'm going to talk sort of a big picture topic, which is really the changing role of biologists and in these interdisciplinary teams that do a variety of shoreline projects. I work particularly on sort of park design and working for local governments and regional governments on things like the New Brighton Park Salt Marsh in Vancouver, or going farther back, the Jericho Beach restoration, which is also for the city of Vancouver. I don't do a lot of private land work or residential work, so that's my sort of the lens I look through. And then also highlighting some lessons from this Dyke Road Park project that I'm going to show you some photos of. So really, our as biologists, our role is changing. If you go back to I think back to my earlier career, and I saw Pamela Zevitz popped up in the chat. You know, we kind of have paralleled in terms of our careers. And if you go back to the 90s, we were often focused on a very sort of limited suite of technical tasks. Where were fish? What was the plant communities? How could we take a design and really get the permits that were necessary? It was a very kind of, and there's still some of that work being done, obviously, by biologists. It's a core part of our task. But these technical tasks have really expanded. We now think about species at risk. That's not actually new legislation or regulation, but things like sea level rise, not just what these coastal communities or coastal sites look like now, but what are they going to look like in 50 or 100 years? What are the ecological processes? Sarah Primo and I, Sarah's done a lot of work on the North Arm Jetty related to the Iona wastewater treatment plant rebuilding. And that's a lot about how do you reconnect different ecological processes through infrastructure that's been designed 50 or 100 years ago. Invasive species, including resident geese, are an issue we deal with, and just changing regulatory requirements. The province and the federal government are always increasing or changing how regulation is interpreted. But I think more importantly, and this is what maybe what I like to stress, is that we're not just technical people in these projects. We're engaged in the local community. We may be part of sort of stewardship groups ourselves. First Nations, which are not, obviously they're a level of government, not just the stewardship group, but they're a key part of how we see the cultural and historical dimensions of these sites. And this is maybe the one thing I learned most working for the City of Vancouver is biodiversity is really a cultural topic. It's not always just a technical topic. It's how do people relate to it on their day-to-day lives, and how do these projects that we work on bring in that topic as well. And it's a lot about teamwork. This is one of the kickoff meetings for the Dyke Road project in Comox, and I think we had 19 or 20 people there, probably 8 or 9 organizations, and that's actually just a small subset of who was involved. So it's very interdisciplinary. There'll be representation of engineers and landscape architects, but also the different groups like the Comox First Nation, Project Watershed. And this is just an example of sort of the complexity we work with as biologists. This is participants in this Dyke Road Park project. I've categorized them into decision makers like the Comox Valley Regional District, which is the client I work for, but the Comox First Nation that both participates on a variety of levels, but is also an approver. Stewardship Center of BC is actually one of the organizations that initiated this project probably 5 to 7 years ago. The regulators, stewardship groups as well, and consultants. We work, obviously the interdisciplinary nature of these projects, you're working with engineers and landscape architects and archaeologists if needed, and different types of engineering. So very collaborative, very much a team-based project, which I think is something that all our roles have kind of evolved into in the past decades. So where is this particular project? If you know the Comox Valley, Courtenay, Comox, and Cumberland, it's on the road. It's on the edge of the Comox estuary, Comox Bay, and it's on the road that connects Courtenay and Comox, called Dyke Road, or has been renamed Comox Road. But it's the shoreline. And if anybody knows Couscous, which is a project that Project Watershed is working on with other participants, including the Comox First Nation, it's nearby, and it's sort of part of the rebuilding of a variety of shorelines in this important estuary. This is what it looked like before. Older park infrastructure, a viewing platform that the Rotary Club had designed back and built in 1988. The road on the right is the road that connects Courtenay and Comox, quite a busy road, and sort of an aging parking lot, a nice viewing platform, but not modern. King tides flooded this parking lot, so a little bit lower than it needed to be, but just not and old fill as well that had covered over some of the estuarine marshes that had occurred in the past. And some of the plant communities, this is an area on the edge of the site that you see the flows coming up that we've restored. So you're looking at narrowleaf cattail and a lot of reed canary grass. So this is an area that's not flooded very frequently, doesn't have the same fish habitat value like the Carex lingby and Juncus arcticus kind of communities that are lower in the lower elevationally. So this was a target area to basically peel back that layer of reed canary grass. In fact, in some cases you're getting Himalayan blackberry colonizing these sites, so it gives you some indication of how terrestrial they're becoming. And this is partway through, so 2/3 of the way through construction. You can still see the road for context on your right. And really we're peeling back this layer of old fill, some old debris from wood waste materials, and getting back to a target elevation that's going to support the fish habitat components, and particularly the tidal marshes that we want to rebuild. And then we're also keeping as much as sort of the riparian areas. There wasn't much along that roadside, so we're not obviously keeping that. But if you look to the left, there's a band of marsh that we've kept as well. We took that fill and then we moved it shoreward out into towards the Courtenay River estuary or channel to the west. So that's basically repurposing that fill, this clean native material that we really want to bring the elevation of these mudflats back into that band that will support Lingby sedge. So this is the start of some work. We're actually going to be continuing in a month or two once we get some more archaeological permits, because many of these sites are very sensitive archaeologically. And you can see the fencing in the foreground. That's for goose protection. That was done by Guardians of the Midcoast Estuaries, working with the Comox First Nation Guardians. And so they've used this kind of there's no synthetic material, so when it breaks down, it just falls apart and dissipates. It's alder posts and willow wattles, but that's to prevent resident geese from browsing these marshes. At the end of it, we had a number of days of planting. These are plugs of Juncus arcticus, kind of a slightly higher elevation than the Carex lingbii, the Lingbii sedge, but quite a rigid upright structure. And during the winter, you can still see it. So that's good for sort of periphyte development and crustaceans and things like that that are going to grow in these marshes. And there's park infrastructure. This is the stage it's at now. We've got these pilings that will hold a metal boardwalk that will go out to a viewing platform to the right. And then the regional district's also rebuilding another viewing platform on the main part of the parking lot. So just to summarize, the practice of biology during my career has become more complex. There's more factors we're considering. We're still expected to cover the technical tasks, and those are expanding as well. But we also support or sometimes even lead these interdisciplinary teams with strong connections to local communities and particularly to First Nation governments. And I think that Green Shores is kind of a nice bridge and a useful tool for incorporating these different requirements. So that's it from me, and I'm going to hand it off to Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Nick. Everyone, I'm Rebecca. I'll just get my screen sharing going here. Sorry, just a sec here. I've got a recording thing over top of my screen sharing button. Here. Can everybody see that okay?
Not yet, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry. Here we go. Let's try that one. What now?
That looks great. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Just gonna hide this. Okay, so yes, my name is Rebecca. I was the project lead on the Esquimalt Gorge Park restoration and demonstration project. And I'm going to talk about lessons learned and the importance of biological expertise. First, I would like to acknowledge that the project was in the Esquimalt Gorge, or the Esquimalt Gorge Park is located within the traditional territories of the Algonquin peoples, including the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. And Algonquin means place to smoke herring, and herring was once a plentiful resource within what is now known as the Gorge Waterway. Here's just a site overview. So the project is similar to the last one that Nick showed, actually, within a long, narrow inlet. It's got freshwater streams flowing into it and is tidally influenced. And of course, a lot of it has been hardened. So a lot of the walls don't have sand, and there's not a lot of beach nourishment going on. And a lot of sediment is coming in from the freshwater streams. So our project objectives are shown here. This is just an overview of the project. So we were enhancing tidal marsh, forage fish habitat, nourishing the beach, which had been washed out, removing riprap along the hardened, previously daylighted Gorge Creek, installation of large woody debris and an accessible beach mat along the beach side, the swimming beach side, and removing a whole bunch of lawn and replacing it with riparian and native plantings. We've got a small permeable path with a viewing area, interpretive signage, and relocated a swing set that was where that square is in number 10 there. So here's just some photos quickly of the project. So on the left here, we've got the start of the riprap removal on the Gorge Creek mouth side of the project. We recontoured previously filled in areas that had created a big bench, basically just sea asparagus growing there, and it was very dry. And so really the sea asparagus was just thriving in certain areas. It was not particularly plentiful there, and so just changing the elevations here and creating a more natural slope was the point. We kept the riprap on site and incorporated it throughout the high water mark to hold down large woody debris and also up into the planting areas. This is the other side of the beach. So you can see the bottom photo shows the seawall on the recreational beach side. And on that side, we added fine wash sand to the escarpment height. In the top photo there on the left, you can see the escarpments that have formed from the washing out of the beach material, the existing beach material. So we just filled up to that height. We did remove a couple of escarpments to scrape those down. And I'm going to talk about that briefly in a second. And then from the majority of the beach nourishment, we added forage fish blend, which I'll talk about in a second as well. We hosted a few community planting parties, and we've got another one coming up soon. We've got over 30 volunteers that contributed, and over 1,000 plants are in already, and I expect we get another 500 to 600 in the next few weeks. So on to lessons learned. We did learn quite a few lessons on this project. And I would say some of the biggest ones are the initial surveys and background research. So the planning for this project included extensive morphological shoreline studies, but didn't include biological surveys. And when we went to get the DFO request for review, they were, asking where are these surveys? And so we kind of had to rush at the end and get those. So this is a lesson for me for sure as a new biologist, and certainly for emerging biologists, really crucial to get these surveys done first. So the first picture on the left shows invasive poplars that were on site. And because this is a migratory bird sanctuary and they're mature poplars, it was decided not to cut them down. However, our initial plans for removing the sod on the site were to scrape the sod and flip it. And if you scrape sod around poplars, they're just going to shoot up a whole new forest of poplars. And so we would have created basically a forest of invasive tree species at the site. Knowing this ahead of time would have helped with our management and with our construction processes. But we kind of figured this out on site during construction, which definitely delayed things a little bit, but we did end up just sheet mulching the sod, not flipping it. And so I'm hoping that that was minimal disturbance and we won't have a bunch of invasive tree sprouts coming up. This project also got delayed a year due to archaeology permits. So just, I would like to emphasize getting those in, just even getting your ARC request in soon, like right when you're doing the project planning, would help save time and money. This project, we barely did any digging. We did a little bit of scraping, and really the sod scraping is the only digging that we were planning for this project, except for the recontouring of the fill on the Gorge Creek mouth side. And we knew that that was fill, that was totally safe to dig out, but underneath the sod and around all these poplars is historical archaeology sites. It's a red zone, and we knew that. And if we had known that initially, we probably would not have incorporated any scraping into the design and might have just sheet mulched, especially knowing that the poplars were there. Instead, our project got delayed a year and cost a ton in archaeology fees to get the permits and everything. And that could have been prevented. There was a really small amount of escarpment that was scraped away at the beach side that required the permit, and nothing else required the permit. So again, just getting those surveys in initially, getting your background knowledge is crucial. And then, as has already been mentioned, just knowing the local fauna around that might impact your plantings or other considerations of your project. We have a goose and deer problem at our site, and so incorporating fencing, like was just shown by Nick, I think it was Nick, sorry. Incorporating that kind of stuff into the plan is really important. This was not incorporated into this plan, and so we're gonna have to provide more management moving forward for this project. And in future projects, I will be incorporating that into them. And so here's another lesson. Again, this one was already talked about by Jeremy. So plant selection is so important. I identifying existing plants on the site. When I looked at the site, and again, this was a very multidisciplinary project. We had people from all over, not just local folks. So the landscape architect who designed the planting list isn't from Vancouver Island, which is where this is located. And so the middle photo there shows creeping mahonia or creeping berberis, I guess now, that is not native to the island, but it's native to coastal BC. And so that was on our planting list, and I didn't realize that it wasn't native to the island. Thankfully, Streamside Nursery, who we got our plants from, pointed that out. So just making sure that the plants that you're selecting are native to even your little like micro regions. And also on the left here, we've got some cattails. They were not incorporated into this project, but they were tried to incorporate into a previous salt marsh project that I worked on. Park staff brought them thinking they'd be really cool, but they're not salt tolerant enough for the estuary. And so just knowing that you're picking the right plants for the project is really important. And I think it was a pretty important lesson here. Another lesson here for me and for I think everyone in this project was asking for Indigenous advice when you're starting out in the planning process. This project was planned and then presented to the Indigenous folks. And it was brought up that we hadn't incorporated any of their traditional food plants. They really are missing salmon berries on the south coast here, or on the South Island. They've all been kind of wiped out, at least in public areas. And so they've requested especially that we incorporate salmon berries and wild celery as well were two key ones that were requested that were not included on this list that could have been. And finally, I would say the biggest lesson for me here was to inspect all materials before they come to your site. So you want to protect your project from the spread of invasive species, confirm suitability of materials, and prevent contamination from unwashed aggregates. So on the left, we've got a photo of some beech wood. We were bringing in large woody debris, and there was a huge storm surge, and another beach nearby had all this woody debris blown up. And so we collected that, or the Esquimalt Parks crew collected it and brought it to the site. And I discovered all of these seeds here, which we don't want on the site. So just checking all your materials, even something like beechwood can bring in invasive seeds. Also, on the right here was an aggregate recommended by our contractor for forage fish material, and it's quite angular and sharp. And so just going to the aggregate supply and checking it before purchasing, before bringing it to the site, helped us decide that that was not the right product for the forage beech material. Again, just confirming the suitability of your intended products. We have another example that happened. We were trying to, be sustainable, reuse, reduce, recycle, and we were trying to get a whole bunch of mulch for the site, and thought we would recycle some playground mulch from another site in the area. And we brought it to the site, and I should have gone and looked at it. I didn't. And so this was a learning experience for me, but it contained a bunch of bindweed. And so we went to spread it, and it was full of bindweed roots. So thankfully we were able to remove it and replace it with other materials that we had to purchase. But just again, inspect all materials before they're brought to the site. Huge learning experience for me. And hopefully others can learn from this. And that is, I think, all for me. Thank you guys so much. Here's just all of our partners and sponsors and funders, and just an ocean view of where the project is currently.
All right. That's wonderful. All right. I would like to extend a great thank you to all of our speakers for your really awesome presentations. We have the opportunity now to answer some questions from the audience. And I know there are some a little further back, so I'm going to go back and read a few of them from one from Pamela Zevitt for Lena. Could you let the folks know what the acronyms in your slide mean? So SPEA or HWM, and then there's a second one there as well.
Yeah, so the acronyms were HWM, which is high water mark, and SPEA or SPEA, which is the Streamside Protection and Enhancement Area that's identified under the Riparian Areas Protection Regulation. And I think the second part of the question was, when the house was built, was there a riparian setback required, and was the riparian areas protection regulation triggered? So this was prior to the riparian areas protection regulation, but the riparian areas regulation, the RAR, was in place at that time. This was 2016. District of Saanich has a streamside development permit area, and they have pre-identified the SPIAs. And if you comply with their SPIA, then you need a streamside development permit, but you don't need to submit a RAPR or a RAR report at that time. And the project did comply with the SPIA that Saanich had identified. So we applied for a streamside development permit, and all of the works were outside the SPIA that are considered development. So the house, the septic, the stormwater management, the gardens, all of that was outside, and the restoration works were within the SPIA area.
Excellent. Thanks for that clarification, Lena. Okay, our next is also from Pamela, about the aggregate that Rebecca shared. It seems a bit small in diameter for forage fish. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, so we used a blend of coarse sand and pea gravel, and that was for both sand lance and surf smelt. Neither of which are currently at the site, but we hope to bring them in. This blend was recommended by Peninsula Stream Society, who did a similar forage fish beach nourishment on the outside coast of southern Vancouver Island, and they successfully had sand lance at the site within months. So we're hopeful that these dimensions are correct, and they are based on recommended dimensions from other biologists. Thank you so much for that question.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. A question from Inna, I believe for Nick here. Do you foresee the role of biologists further changing or evolving in restoration projects in the future? I guess anyone can answer this question if they have any points they would like to share.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think I make the case that there's always going to be incremental changes where, we didn't 30 years ago, invasive species, for an example, wasn't kind of a huge topic we worried about, and now it's quite important. Climate is going to be something that obviously we're going to hear more about, and First Nations and First Nations governance is a huge topic, and that's going to affect all aspects of biology, and shoreline restoration is going to be a key part of that. One thing that I think also has changed is that, the era of sort of the thick report with all the technical information that you're going to hand off to your client, and that's going to sort of support good decision making is not just gone, but long gone. And it's now about how do we kind of tell the story properly. And it is that cultural component that gets incorporated. So you can't just say, oh yeah, here's the facts and make good decisions. It's not going to be like that. So how do we kind of bridge that topic and again sort of tell the story of these sites or the history of these sites or how these projects kind of come together? So that's a different role as well for biologists to be part of.
Definitely. Another question for Elena. What methods do you find are most effective for the removal of invasive species in the Prospect Lake project?
Because that site is so small, all of the invasive species removal work was done by the owners by hand. So it's an ongoing maintenance for that site, and because it's so small, using heavy equipment of any kind is not feasible. It's too small an area, but it does mean it's manageable by hand as well.
Nice. I have one more question here, and if you do have any more questions, anyone, feel free to share them in the chat. Have any of the presenters worked on a project where the upland property was facing an erosion risk? For example, required erosion protection of their homes, but the area was also an important feeder bluff for the immediate offshore ecosystem, like eelgrass beds, and how you sort of addressed those conflicting priorities, and how might you approach that if you haven't worked on that kind of project?
I'll jump in. It's a very tough issue because those feeder bluffs are just obviously they naturally erode over time, and that's the whole function of them. They feed a variety of ecosystems, forage fish, coastal sand ecosystems, all those things. it's hard to be a consultant in those topics because you have a sort of a limited ability to kind of convince people. So you're often relying on regulation, and more you're relying on engineers and insurers because those houses have to be insured, and so the liability risk that poses is often the driving force for decisions around setbacks and things like that. So it's a bit less about the biology and the downstream effects than those more sort of technical aspects that are often led by others other than biologists. That's my experience, at least.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I might add to that, which is just following on what Nick said, which is where there's existing structures, it becomes very difficult to do anything that allows erosion to continue because those structures become at risk. And but municipalities are more and more bringing in shoreline development permit areas, which are requiring structures to be set back and have geotechnical assessments before the location of a structure can be permitted, which hopefully over time is going to allow that managed retreat of development further back to allow those natural erosional processes to continue, and hopefully fewer seawalls and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy or Rebecca, would either of you like to chime in for this question?
Jeremy here. I'm just that's a tough one. I picture sites in Nova Scotia where this is happening, and I would say that they're really high energy coastlines, and often in places where you wouldn't have a seawall anyway, or you would be infeasible. So I think for us, it's easy to have the erosion feeding the eelgrass or the beaches downstream or whatever. It's hard to actually protect the home. So in terms of how to manage the conflicting priorities, yeah, it's what the previous speakers said. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't have anything additional to add to that either. Probably moving the house back would be the best option, but not the cheapest.
Mm-hmm. Managed retreat is the beast that no one likes to talk about, but that's going to become more and more prevalent in our day-to-day lives. Yeah. Thank you. And while you're here, Rebecca, there's another question for you. Sorry if they missed this, but what was the reasoning behind reworking the water edge at your site?
Okay, so I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but we reworked two water edges. So one along the Gorge Creek mouth, where it had been daylighted, it had been hardened with riprap and was kind of a vertical bank with no fish habitat. So we recontoured that. We removed the riprap, recontoured it, and within, like, as we were doing it, we had stickleback going into where the water didn't used to have access to, and so we basically expanded the fish habitat potential. We made a more natural shoreline, and we're going to have overhanging vegetation growing along that eventually. The other side where the escarpments were forming had been also filled in and had lawn right along the edge of the ocean there, and so the sand getting pulled out from the beach over time and not being replenished had created these big escarpments that had been formed during high tides and wave action. And so there was erosion happening kind of underneath the sod cover. And so we just scraped down the highest of those, that sod escarpment, and then filled up to the level that had previously been there, again, to reduce erosion and to replenish the sand on the beach. So hopefully that answers those questions.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have time for maybe the last few questions here. If you do have any further questions, we do have the contact information for each of our speakers that you can reach out to them directly. But here the question is, were any of the restoration projects discussed on this webinar, either discussed or presented at the recent SER North American Conference in Vancouver, BC?
Not mine, nope.
No.
Doesn't appear to be so.
No, not the home bay one.
No. Interesting question. I assume there would have been a follow-up question if there were any yeses. But But there is another question here. Are cement retaining walls that extend well into the intertidal zone considered trespassing structures to be removed in both American and Canadian intertidal zones? And there's a follow-up to that on rock retaining structures that extend the upland property into the entitled, or from the upland property into the intertidal zone. Lots of words there.
Well, the American and Canadian intertidal zones are completely different, so I don't think you can, and I'm not going to interpret American law, but Canadian law typically, except for a few exceptions like Burrard Inlet, the high water mark is the delineation of the end of private property and the beginning of the provincial land base. So that's why aquaculture is regulated as a provincial asset. It's on the bed of the ocean. The water column is federal and DFO, and that's why we have Transport Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. But unless that's a permitted structure, like and lots are, you can't just go and build a concrete retaining wall or put anything outside the private property delineated by that high water mark. So, I mean, there's a little interpretation of where the high water mark is generally, but not much. It's usually pretty clear. So you can't do that, no.
Lena?
Just to add on to that, my experience, ones that have been put in a long time ago are often no one's required to take them out until something else is happening on the shoreline. But if somebody does something newer, even in the last 10 or 15 years, and then I'm speaking mostly about private property here, and then somebody goes to do something on their property and that encroachment is discovered, that has got onto Crown land and doesn't have a Crown foreshore lease, then they can be required to remove them. And often before they're allowed to do anything else on the property that requires a permit, that needs to be dealt with.
Great, thank you for your answers. Well, that's all the time we have for questions at the moment. Like I said, if you have more questions, feel free to send them to our speakers. For everyone on either online right now or watching in the future, we have a survey for you to take about the webinar. It's a short one. It takes less than 3 minutes to complete, and we would really appreciate if everyone could take it to give your feedback. And the link is also in the chat if you can't access it via the slide.
Thanks, Kelly. And thanks to everyone for the really great presentations. And I just want to say, please feel free to give us a shout out at the Stewardship Center with any other questions, or just stay in touch. And have a great day. And thanks again, Anna, behind the scenes.
Thanks, everyone.